Let's talk about something we almost never think about: time itself. Or more specifically, how the ancient Greeks thought about it. Because let me tell you, it's a fascinating and honestly a totally different world from ours.
Okay, here's a date for you, 323 BC. We all know it, right? The year Alexander the Great died. It feels so solid, final. But here's the thing, and this is wild. That date meant absolutely nothing to Alexander, or his generals, or anyone. The whole idea of BC hadn't been invented yet, so how in the world did they keep track of what year it was?
And that right there is the big puzzle we're going to unpack. See, the ancient Greeks didn't have one single universal calendar like we do. Nope. They had this incredible patchwork of local systems, and digging into them tells us so much about who they were.
All right, to really get this, you got to wrap your head around three key ideas. For the Greeks, time wasn't this abstract thing ticking away for everyone everywhere. It was, first, local. It was all about your city. Second, it was civic, deeply tied into politics and religion. And third, it was contextual. A date only made sense if you were in that community. So let's dive into what that actually looked like.
Okay, first up, this idea of local time. And when I say local, I mean hyper-local. You've got to completely forget the idea of a national calendar. We're talking about something way, way more fragmented than that.
So what was the anchor for all this? The moon. Pretty much every Greek calendar was lunar, based on the phases of the moon. And that's huge, because it ties everything directly to the natural world, right? To the seasons, and most importantly, to their religious festivals, which were pretty much the beating heart of the community.
And this is where things get really wild. It meant that every single city-state, every polis, had its own calendar. The month we might call July could have a totally different name in Athens than it did in Sparta. Even New Year's Day was different depending on where you lived. Now, to stop the calendar from getting completely out of whack with the seasons, they just stick in an extra 13th month every now and then. It sounds messy, yeah? But it was also a system that was deeply personal to each city.
Okay, so if the months were a local free-for-all, what about the years? How did they track those? Well, they didn't count them like we do, 1, 2, 3. Instead, they tied them to people. Time for them was literally a kind of political memory. So instead of saying, the year 404, an Athenian would say something like, in the year of Euclides was Archon. The entire year was named after the guy in charge. It's amazing, right? It tied every single event directly to the city's political leadership at that moment.
And here's exactly what that looked like. If you saw an official date, this is what you'd get. It's not just a number. It's a very specific point in time, during this guy's term, in this specific local month. It's super precise, but only if you're an Athenian. To a Spartan, this would be gibberish.
And it wasn't just Athens doing this with their archons. Nope. The basic idea was the same all over Greece, just with different titles. In Sparta, you might date something by the head ephor. Elsewhere, maybe it's the head priestess of a big temple, or the city council. The key thing is, time was always measured by people, and their time and power.
Right, so you're probably thinking, if everything was so local, how could anyone write a history of all of Greece? How could someone like Thucydides make any sense of it all? Well, that's where the Olympic Games come into play. They became a kind of common ground.
You see, the Olympics were one of the only things that were truly pan-Hellenic, meaning for all Greeks. Every city-state was involved, everyone knew the 4-year cycle, so it basically became the closest thing they had to a universal clock. Now, you wouldn't use it for day-to-day stuff, but if you were a historian trying to line up events from different cities, it was perfect. So the whole system worked on a 4-year cycle called an Olympiad. It all kicked off with the very first games, which we date to 776 BC. So an event could be dated to something like the second year of the 110th Olympiad. This gave historians a shared ruler, a way to put an event from Athens and an event from Sparta on the same timeline and see how they related.
And let's circle all the way back to where we started, with Alexander the Great. To a Greek historian, he didn't die in 323 BC. He died during the 114th Olympiad. It was only much, much later that scholars could take those Olympiad dates, cross-reference them with all the local lists of magistrates and kings, and build the timeline we use today.
But here's the thing. This isn't just a bunch of technical trivia about calendars. No, this way of keeping time reveals a totally different way of seeing the world, a different philosophy of history itself, one that's all about cycles, not straight lines.
And you can really see this when you compare it to Rome. The Romans eventually created a centralized, linear timeline, counting up from the founding of their city. That implies a story of constant forward progress, right? But Greek time was totally different. It stayed local,
It was based on many different centers, and it was cyclical. It wasn't one big story of progress, it was lots of little stories repeating themselves.
This gets us to the core idea: cyclical time. For the Greeks, history wasn't some straight road heading off into an unknown future. It was more like a collection of patterns they saw again and again, patterns in human nature, in politics, in how cities rise and then fall.
And you could see this worldview reflected in everything. The seasons came back around, the festivals happened on the same day every year, the games came back every 4 years, and when they looked at history, they saw the same story play out. Cities rise, cities fall. Their entire way of measuring time was built to mirror that natural political rhythm. So the life of the city, its festivals, its games, it wasn't just a dot on a timeline moving forward. It was part of this recurring cycle, a human experience that their grandparents had lived through and their grandchildren would live through too. And that's what made Alexander the Great so earth-shattering. What he did was on such a massive scale that it just broke the old cycles. He completely shattered that predictable world of city-states fighting each other. He basically forced people to start thinking about history in a new, more linear way, just to try and make sense of the enormous changes he'd made.
And here's the kicker. The BC/AD system we use for everything, the one that our entire view of history is built on, it wasn't even invented until the 500s AD. A monk came up with it, centuries after the classical world was long gone. It's a surprisingly new invention.
So that leaves us with a really interesting thought, doesn't it? The Greek way of measuring time perfectly reflected their world. It was cyclical, local, and all about the community. So it makes you wonder, how does our system, this linear, global, totally abstract clock we live by, how does that shape the way we see our own lives, our own history, and our own future?